Let's focus now on what is happening with the sanctions story. The US ramping up pressure on Putin. The latest moves coming out of D.C. imposing sanctions on his two adult daughters. The Russian foreign minister's wife, Sergei Lavrov's wife, and daughter have also been added to the sanctions list. Within the last few minutes as well, the UK is announcing asset freezes on Sberbank and Credit Bank of Moscow. So we're getting more headlines coming through there. And the Estonian Prime Minister is calling for hard-hitting energy sanctions on Russia, saying that Ukraine will not win the war with inadequate sanctions. Joining us now, Kataryna Wolczuk, an associate fellow at Chatham House in the Russia and Eurasia program. Is the Estonian Prime Minister right? Are we not doing enough yet? Do we need to see more? Why not, in the words of Guy Verhofstadt today in the European Parliament, why not do it all now?
This is very hard, and we are seeing a lot. We are seeing what is actually, there are unprecedented sanctions. Russia used to be the 11th largest economy in the world. And what we see, such a large economy has never been hit by such sanctions. Having said that, what the West now really reckons with is the fact that we have very extensive interdependence with Russia, with Russian sort of financial institutions, with Russian banks, but specifically energy as well.
Yeah.
And the long-standing dependence now is something that the EU in particular, but especially countries like Germany and Austria, have to really undo very quickly, and that cannot be done overnight.
Well, so Kataryna, obviously there's great economic pressure that has to be considered here. At what point will political pressure from other allies outweigh that?
Yes, we can see already, even before the sanctions have been finalized, we can see already a lot of critique that they are not strong enough. We know by now the sanctions are necessary, but as it is, they are not sufficient. Because the regime, the Kremlin, the political regime in Russia is very resilient. If we look at the Russian media, they are full of words of defiance that will survive it. So financial, economic pressure on Russia can only work in the long time while people are dying in Ukraine, as we speak of now.
The UK now announcing, we have this now on the Bloomberg, the UK is sanctioning 8 more wealthy Russians. We'll get the details of those. You can find them, obviously, on the Bloomberg terminal as the headlines continue to drop here. Kataryna, sanctions serve not only foreign policy purposes, but also domestic policy purposes as well. We have seen the grim scenes coming out of Bucha. We obviously expect more. Is there a certain reluctance here, do you think, certainly within European capitals, to deliver all of the sanctions at one time? Because that then, from a domestic policy point of view, doesn't give more options when that news ultimately emerges. Are we seeing a sequence here, an escalation of sanctions as things get worse and worse in Ukraine?
Yes, we see that. But we also know that the sanctions, as it is, they're not going to stop until and unless we stop financing the machine war of Russia. And this is financed by $1 billion daily payments to Russia for energy supplies. Coal supplies to the EU, which is going to be basically implemented very soon, they only deliver about $4 billion per year to Russia. So even the sanctions as they are, and especially the sanctions about wealthy Russians, there are questions, why now? Why not sooner? Including President Putin's daughters, 2 daughters, which are going to be allegedly sanctioned now. Why on now? But we know that the big sort of issue is energy supplies, oil and gas. And from that point of view, it can take months, if not years, for this to be implemented. So we have a relatively sort of limited number of options before the nuclear in inverted commas, on energy supplies.
Okay.
And then
well,
you have to get ready.
Well, let's talk about real nuclear weapons, though, Kataryna, not just nuclear in the kind of quote mark sense that you are referring to it. The risk of nuclear weapons, the risk of, at the very least, chemical or biological weapons. I mean, what is the West going to have left to play if we're reaching a point where we've reached peak sanctions?
Yes. this is, unfortunately, on the one hand, we can congratulate ourselves that the West, the US, and the EU have really done those sort of massive, what we are talking about is a new sort of type of warfare, economic warfare, using the financial system, energy to punish Russia. It is not sufficient. So although
does that mean, Kataryna, though, like real warfare, real use of force is going to have to come into play if this escalates further?
It really depends, because the narrative at the moment from the military side, we cannot intervene, only military supplies. What does it take for the Western public to stomach, to see, in order for that pressure to basically, what we are talking about, the responsibility to protect principle to be activated? Yep. My feeling, as of today, it will take many more deaths and massacres for that to happen.
Let's talk about deterrence. The concern now is that, and I think there are questions about the military capability of achieving this, but the concern is definitely that Vladimir Putin does not stop with Ukraine, that he looks maybe to go elsewhere. I'm wondering what kind of deterrence you think is now necessary from NATO. The chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff was yesterday on Capitol Hill talking about the possibility of permanent US bases, forward bases, in NATO territory. Do you think that is a good idea? Do you think that is something that would deter Vladimir Putin? Or do you think that this would accelerate maybe his desire to make moves into those areas?
Putin is afraid of NATO. He attacked Ukraine because Ukraine would not be defended. And he said in one of the interviews prior to the invasion, we have to do it now because what? Later are we going to fight with NATO? So the eastern flank is, despite all the rhetoric of our sort of solidarity and also all the rhetoric from Russia, how much threatened is Russia, we know that the Russian enclave, Kaliningrad, is really sort of stuffed with offensive weapons against basically the NATO countries. So there is an asymmetry what Russia has on its western flank versus what NATO has. So I think at a certain point we will have to see, because the rhetoric from the Kremlin, not only from the Kremlin, but from the Russian people, we have a bit of sort of war euphoria, and there is demand. There are very strong sort of, not only anti-Polish, but also sort of a rhetoric against the Baltic states, against Moldova, and other countries like Kazakhstan. So I do feel we get worse before we are out of the woods.